My stepdaughter placed a $28.6 million sale contract on my kitchen table and told me to practice smiling for the cameras. My son stood behind her with a pen in his hand, waiting for me to sign away the orchard, the house, the spring, and the water rights my wife and I had protected for 42 years. Then he said, very gently, that if I made this difficult, they already had the papers to prove I could no longer manage my own affairs. Before this story goes any further, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from. I want to know how far this story travels while the truth is still unfolding. I did not shout. I did not knock the pen out of his hand. I just looked at the blue folder between us, took one sip of black coffee, and asked the only question that mattered. Did either of you read the clause Miriam wrote under the springhouse floor? My stepdaughter smiled because she thought I was confused. My son looked embarrassed because he thought I was buying time. Derek, her husband, standing by the back door in a tailored gray coat, went completely still. That was how I knew he had missed it. Men like Derek think land is lines on a survey map, numbers in a purchase agreement, and signatures at the bottom of expensive paper. They do not understand that old promises can be buried deeper than pipes, and some promises are built to open only when betrayal is bold enough to step on them. My name is Leonard Cross. I am 74 years old. For 39 years I worked as a county financial controller in Northern Oregon, reading budgets, audits, property transfers, water district filings, and contracts so dull that younger men used to joke I could smell fraud through a stapler. I retired with a pension, a bad left knee, a habit of keeping copies of everything, and one piece of land that mattered more to me than any account I ever balanced. Cross Orchard sits on 18 acres outside Ash Hollow, just far enough from town that the nights are still dark and the mornings still smell like wet leaves instead of exhaust. There are apple trees my father grafted, pear trees my wife saved during a late frost, a small clapboard house with a deep porch, and a spring that comes out of basalt rock behind the old packing shed. Most people saw that spring and thought it was pretty. Developers saw it and thought boutique water rights. My wife Miriam saw it and said, "Leonard, water remembers who protects it." I used to laugh at that. Not because I thought she was wrong. Because Miriam had a way of saying things that sounded like poetry and municipal policy at the same time. She had been a school librarian for 31 years, the kind of woman who could silence a room full of fifth graders by lowering her voice. She came into my life with a 10-year-old daughter named Valerie and 2 boxes of books, and within a month my house had labels on shelves, curtains that matched nothing, and a child at my kitchen table asking whether I knew that stepfathers in fairy tales were usually useless. I told her I intended to improve the literature. She laughed then. Valerie laughed easily when she was young. I try to remember that, because if I only remember the woman she became, I lose the child I once loved. Miriam and I married when I was 32 and she was 31. She had already survived one mean husband and one lean year where she worked mornings at the library, evenings at a grocery store, and still found time to read Valerie a chapter every night. I had never been married. I had numbers, routines, a government job, and a house too quiet for a man who pretended he liked quiet. Miriam filled it. Valerie grew up in that house. I taught her how to drive on the service road behind the orchard. I paid for braces. I sat in school gyms while she played clarinet badly and with confidence. I stood beside Miriam the day Valerie left for college and pretended I had something in my eye when she hugged me last, after hugging her mother first. I never used the word step when I spoke about her unless paperwork required it. She was my daughter in every way that mattered, until money taught her a new definition of family. The spring was the heart of the orchard, though none of us understood how valuable it would become until years later. In the late 80s, a bottling company tried to buy rights all along the valley, but most families were too tired, too poor, or too confused to fight them. Miriam fought them with a canvas bag full of library records and a temper wrapped in perfect manners. I fought them with parcel maps, filings, and a stack of water reports I had copied before anyone noticed they were missing from the county annex. We won enough protection to keep our spring private, but Miriam did not trust victory that depended on memory. In 1992, she asked an old attorney named Samuel Pike to draft a covenant. It was not fancy. It was not dramatic. It said that the spring and the primary water rights could not be sold, transferred, leased, collateralized, or assigned to any commercial bottling, extraction, resort, or industrial development without direct personal consent from both original grantors while living, and if either original grantor was dead, then from the surviving grantor after an independent capacity review by a neutral physician and a public notice period. If anyone living in the house, related by blood or marriage or domestic tie, attempted to force a transfer by fraud, incapacity pressure, concealed buyer interest, or private coercion, the water rights would pass into the Miriam Cross Public Spring Trust for 99 years. The orchard land tied to the spring would become conservation property with a small life estate for the surviving owner. That was Miriam. She did not just lock a door. She hid the key where only betrayal would step hard enough to find it. We kept the signed covenant in the county records, but Samuel Pike also made us put a copy beneath the loose stone under the springhouse floor. Miriam said official files can burn, lawyers can retire, and children can forget who raised them. Stone remembers better. At the time, I thought she was being theatrical. I was wrong. Miriam died 7 years ago in October. Not suddenly. Sudden death is a door slamming. Cancer is a house emptying one room at a time. First she stopped walking the orchard after dinner. Then she stopped shelving books at the library. Then she stopped arguing with the television news, which frightened me more than the scans. By the end she weighed almost nothing, but her eyes were still sharp. 3 nights before she died, she made me promise 2 things. First, keep the spring out of corporate hands. Second, do not let love make me stupid where Valerie was concerned. I did not like that second promise. I told Miriam that grief was making her suspicious. She took my hand with fingers thin as dry twigs and said, "No, Leonard, grief is making you sentimental, and sentiment is the easiest door to open from the outside." She was not accusing Valerie of anything then. She was telling me that need changes people, and Valerie had married a man who knew how to use need as a handle. Derek Vale entered our family wearing humility like a rented suit. He was handsome in that polished, untroubled way men can be when they have never been held responsible for the messes they leave behind. He called me sir for the first year, helped Miriam carry groceries, praised the orchard, praised the house, praised the light in the valley, praised everything except work that required staying with one thing after it stopped flattering him. He had ideas, always. An organic cider brand. A farm stay. A wedding venue. A wellness retreat. A heritage water label. He spoke of vision, scale, capital, positioning, legacy. I spoke of pruning, irrigation, taxes, liability, and the difference between a dream and a spreadsheet. Valerie loved the way he made the future sound expensive. Miriam did not. She once said, "Derek does not love places, he loves the mirror places hold up to him." I remembered that sentence years later when he stood in my kitchen and told me cameras were coming. After Miriam died, I lost discipline in small ways. Not with money. Never with money. But with boundaries. Valerie came by more often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Derek. She brought soup I did not want and took laundry I could do myself. She told me I was grieving too quietly. She said the house was too much for one person. She said Derek worried about the orchard accounts. She said she worried about me falling among the trees where no one would hear. At first it sounded like care. Care often does, especially when the person offering it uses your loneliness as proof that you need them. The first winter after Miriam died, a storm took down 3 old apple trees along the north row. I was out there with a chainsaw before sunrise because grief had made sleep useless. Derek arrived in new boots and a jacket too clean for work, carrying coffee and concern. He watched me buck one limb, then said, "Leonard, you should not be doing this alone anymore." I said, "Then pick up a saw." He smiled like I had missed the point. That was Derek's gift. He could make labor look like a conversation about strategy. The move began with one room. Valerie said she and Derek needed to stay for a few weeks while their condo was being repaired after a pipe burst. A few weeks became a season became a year, and by the second year they had stopped apologizing for the boxes in the upstairs hallway. I was not blind, but I was tired. Tired people accept arrangements they would have questioned when they still had someone to discuss them with at night. Valerie cooked dinner twice a week. Derek handled vendors. My son Caleb, who lived 3 hours away and worked as a school principal, visited when he could and trusted Valerie because she used words like safety, routine, and support. Caleb had his own guilt about not being closer. Derek noticed that too. Predators notice guilt the way dogs hear whistles. The changes were small at first. My office files moved into labeled bins because Valerie said dust was bad for my breathing. The old springhouse key disappeared from the hook by the back door and returned on a different hook, then in a drawer, then in Derek's pocket because he had been checking the pump, though the springhouse had no pump. Miriam's reading chair moved from the window to the corner because Derek said the room flowed better. The Orchard account statements began arriving at Valerie's email because she had helped me set up digital backup and used her address as recovery contact. I told myself these were irritations, not alarms. Then the red stakes appeared. I found the first one on a foggy morning in March, driven into the ground near the lower pair row. Red survey tape fluttered from the top. I pulled it out and carried it to breakfast. Derek looked up from his phone and said, "Probably county drainage markers." I spent 39 years reading county drainage maps. It was not a county marker. The next week, 2 more stakes appeared near the springhouse path. I asked Valerie whether someone had been on the property. She frowned as if the question itself made her sad. "Dad," she said, "you have been misplacing things lately. Maybe you saw those last year and forgot." There it was, the first soft stone in a wall they were building around my mind. After that, memory became a topic in the house. Not mine as I experienced it. Mine as they described it. Valerie told Caleb I had left the oven on. I had not. Derek told a neighbor I had forgotten to close the gate. I had closed it. Valerie told Dr. Madsen, my regular physician, that I had been repeating myself. I repeat numbers when I am checking them. It is not decline, it is habit. Still, the word concern began moving around me like smoke. No one accused me directly. That would have been too crude. They only worried. They worried in doorways. They worried in lowered voices. They worried when I entered rooms, then stopped talking quickly enough to make me feel like an intruder in my own house. By summer, Derek had installed cameras outside, supposedly for security. One faced the driveway. One faced the packing shed. One faced the springhouse path. None faced the kitchen where the real theft was beginning. The first real clue came from a waitress named June at the Ash Hollow Diner. I had been eating breakfast there every Thursday since before Valerie was born. June refilled my coffee, leaned close, and said, "Leonard, why is a man from Cascade Reserve asking whether you still sign documents clearly?" I looked up at her. June did not gossip for sport. She gathered information the way barns gather dust, quietly and in useful layers. I asked what man. She said he wore a black vest, expensive watch, city shoes, and he asked whether you were still sharp enough to understand a large sale. I asked what sale. She gave me the look women give old men when they are deciding whether to protect them from the truth or arm them with it. Then she said, "The Orchard." I went home and found Derek in the dining room with his laptop open and a map on the table. He closed it too quickly. Fast hands are louder than confessions if you know how to watch. That evening I went to the county records office, where the young clerk still calls me Mr. Cross because I trained his mother. There was no sale filed, no formal option agreement, no transfer. But there was an inquiry on water rights tied to my parcel, made by a holding company called North Star Hospitality Renewal. Holding company names are like masks. They tell you only what the wearer wants to hide. I copied everything. Then I called Samuel Pike, the old attorney who had drafted the covenant. His number had been disconnected. He had died 3 years earlier. His practice had been absorbed by a firm in Portland. His old office was now a yoga studio, because time has a cruel sense of humor. But Samuel had one living assistant, Anita Rowe, who had retired to a cottage 2 towns over. I found her through a church directory and drove there without telling anyone. Anita was 81, small, sharp, and wearing gardening gloves when she opened the door. When I told her my name, she said, "Miriam Cross's husband." Not Leonard. Not Mr. Cross. Miriam Cross's husband. That was enough for me to trust her. She remembered the covenant. More than that, she remembered why Miriam had wanted it. Your wife sat in Samuel's office and said, "If money ever comes for that spring, it will come wearing a family face." Anita made tea I did not want and brought out an old index card from a metal box. Samuel kept backup references by matter number, and there it was, Cross Spring Covenant, recorded 1992, secondary copy placed on site beneath original springhouse floor stone. Anita looked at me over her glasses and said, "If someone is trying to sell that water, they either do not know the covenant exists or they believe they can prove you are too diminished to invoke it." I asked what happens if they try. She tapped the index card once. "Then your wife's trap opens." I drove home with that sentence in my shirt pocket like a match. Your wife's trap opens. The next weeks taught me that a conspiracy is rarely one dramatic plan. It is a series of ordinary steps taken by people who have convinced themselves the end result will justify every small betrayal. Valerie started asking me to sign harmless forms. Medical release. Account access. Vendor permission. Orchard maintenance authorization. I signed nothing without reading. That irritated her. "Dad," she said one night, "not everything is a courtroom." I told her no, but everything is a record if it matters later. She looked away. Derek became warmer after that, which worried me more than coldness. Cold men have lost patience. Warm men have found a new angle. He brought me coffee in the mornings. He asked about Miriam. He suggested recording some family memories for a preservation video before the property changed too much. That phrase stayed in my head. Before the property changed too much. I asked what he meant. He smiled and said, "You know, seasons, repairs, life." I began keeping my own recordings. Oregon law is not a toy, and I knew better than to play lawyer with a pocket phone, but in my own kitchen during conversations where I was present, I recorded when I could. More important, I wrote dates, times, words, who stood where, what papers appeared, what disappeared. Engineers document loads. Controllers document money. Grieving husbands document threats when their dead wives trained them better than they knew. My neighbor Clara Bell became my second pair of eyes. She was 68, widowed, and ran the plant nursery on the edge of town. Miriam had bought marigolds from her every spring. Clara could identify a liar faster than a weed. She started watching the driveway when I called. She wrote down license plates. The first belonged to a survey company. The second belonged to a private elder care consultant. The third belonged to a man who sat in his car outside my orchard for 20 minutes and never came to the door. Clara took a photograph of him eating a protein bar with his mouth open, because she said criminals deserve unflattering evidence. The elder care consultant was named Marion Vale. No relation to Derek, though the name gave me a bad start. She came to the house with Valerie while Derek was away and spoke to me in the careful, slow tone people use when they have been told you might not follow conversation. She asked whether I had trouble bathing. I told her I had trouble tolerating condescension. She asked whether I managed bills alone. I told her I had audited county budgets larger than her entire agency's annual revenue. She smiled the professional smile of someone putting difficult in a mental file. After she left, I found Valerie in the laundry room crying quietly. Not performing. Not loud enough to be heard. Quietly. I almost went to her. Then Derek entered through the back door, and she wiped her face so fast it looked practiced. He did not ask why she had been crying. He asked whether I signed the assessment release. She shook her head. He shut the door with a softness that was worse than a slam. Before the buyer revealed himself publicly, I spent 3 weeks learning how deep Derek's version of care had already entered the town. That may sound strange. People imagine conspiracies as secret rooms and whispered phone calls. In my case, the worst part was how much of the lie had been placed in ordinary conversation. The pharmacist asked whether Valerie would be picking up my prescriptions from now on. I had not authorized that. The bank teller asked whether my daughter should be added to appointment notices. I had not requested that. A clerk at the county annex said he was sorry to hear I was stepping back from active management. I was not stepping back. Derek had not only prepared documents. He had seeded assumptions. Assumptions are dangerous because no one remembers who planted them. They just grow in the background until everyone behaves as if the field has always looked that way. Evelyn made me map the assumptions. We created a chart on Caleb's dining room table. Column 1, person or office. Column 2, what they believed. Column 3, who told them. Column 4, proof if any. It was ugly and useful. The pharmacist believed Valerie was coordinating medicine because Derek had said my schedule was confusing me. The bank believed a family transition was coming because Valerie had asked about joint notice options. The county clerk believed I was retiring from orchard operations because Derek had called about transfer taxes. The Grange Hall believed the signing event was my idea because Derek had paid the deposit with a check marked cross-family legacy. Every lie had been softened before delivery. No one had been told, Leonard is incompetent and we are taking over. They had been told, Leonard is tired, Leonard is private, Leonard is grateful, Leonard trusts the family, Leonard wants this handled gently. That word gently appeared everywhere. It became the perfume sprayed over theft. I began visiting people in person. Not to argue. To correct the record. I went to the pharmacy. With my own identification and removed every outside pickup authorization. I went to the bank and changed every notice channel. I went to the county annex and requested a written log of every inquiry tied to my parcels. I went to the Grange Hall and asked for the event contract. The woman there, Marcy, looked embarrassed when she handed it to me. Derek had listed me as honorary host, not signing authority. Honorary host of my own removal. I signed for a copy and thanked her. She said, Mr. Cross, I thought you knew. I said, that is why assumptions are cheaper than signatures. They do not need ink. She cried, which I did not expect. She had lost her father the year before and said her brother had handled everything. As she said it, her own face changed. Sometimes truth does that. It walks into one story and opens another. She asked whether she should cancel the event. I said no. Let it stand. Her eyes widened. Mr. Cross, are you sure? I said, Marcy, sometimes you do not stop a man from building a stage. Sometimes you check the exits, invite witnesses, and let him step under the lights. She did not understand fully, but she smiled through tears. I think she wanted to see one old father win somewhere, even if it was not hers. During those weeks, I also learned that Derek had courted the orchard workers in his own way. He told Miguel the new resort would have year-round positions and benefits. He told Nora the old picking work was hard on bodies and the future would be easier. He told 2 younger workers they might supervise landscaping teams after redevelopment. He did not promise in writing, of course. Men like Derek promise verbally because spoken hope leaves fewer fingerprints. When I told them the sale was not authorized, they were angry, but not at first in the direction I expected. Hope, once offered, hates being corrected. Miguel said, "Mr. Cross, my daughter needs insurance." Nora said, "We cannot live on memories." They were not wrong. That was the hardest part. The orchard had never made anyone rich. Derek had used real economic pain as bait. That is why easy villains are for children's books. Real villains often wrap themselves around real needs. I brought the workers to the packing shed and showed them the trust outline Evelyn had drafted. Education grants. Seasonal labor protections. Restoration funding if the settlement came through. Public access limits that still allowed paid maintenance and harvest programming. It was not $28.6 million. It was not luxury jobs in linen uniforms. But it was real. Miguel read the document slowly. Nora read over his shoulder and corrected his pronunciation of hydrology, though neither of them needed the word. Finally Nora said, "So the trees stay?" I said, "Yes." She said, "Then we stay angry at the right man." That became another line I kept. Stay angry at the right man. Anger is like water. If you do not channel it, it floods whatever is closest. Derek had depended on that too, workers angry at an old owner, children angry at a stubborn father, neighbors angry at delay, buyers angry at risk. He had placed himself where the anger would pass around him toward me. Evelyn called it redirection. Clara called it hiding behind your own smoke. Again, Clara's version was better. Caleb found another channel of redirection in the family texts. Derek had been messaging him for months. Nothing overt. Just little concerns. Your dad was pretty worked up today. Your dad forgot we discussed the inspection. Your dad may be embarrassed if you question him directly. Your dad trusts you, but he gets defensive when he feels watched. Derek was training my son to approach me as a problem. Caleb printed every message and sat with them for an hour, silent. Then he said, "I thought I was being patient with you." I said, "You were being managed around me." He said, "I should have known." I said, "Yes, maybe." He looked at me then, hurt. I did not soften it. Love cannot repair what it refuses to name. Then I added, "But you know now." That was the part that mattered. He put the messages in Evelyn's folder and wrote, "Manipulation of family perception," in neat block letters across the top. My son was learning to document in the family style. Miriam would have laughed and bought him a better pen. The strangest document came from the library. Miriam's library. After the newspaper article about the dispute hinted at a protected spring, the current head librarian, a young woman named Tessa, called me. She said they had a sealed envelope in an archive drawer with Miriam's handwriting on it. I drove there with Caleb. The library smelled the same as it always had, paper, floor wax, and children pretending not to run. Tessa brought us to a back room and handed me the envelope with both hands. On the front, Miriam had written, "For Leonard, if someone tries to make my caution look like sentiment." I had to sit down before opening it. Inside was not another legal document. It was a list. 12 observations about Derek from the first 5 years of Valerie's marriage. Miriam had dated each one. Derek asked about deed transfer language at Christmas dinner. Derek joked that old farms die because old men do not know when to accept help. Derek asked whether Leonard had ever updated his will. Derek moved conversation away from water protection whenever Valerie asked about it. Derek described assisted living as asset simplification. Derek used the word legacy only when money was present. There were 12 of them, each precise, each patient, each written in the hand I had watched fill grocery lists and library cards and birthday notes for decades. At the bottom Miriam wrote, "I may be wrong about him, and I pray I am, but if I am not, Leonard will forgive too slowly and trust too long. Please let this letter shorten the distance between warning and action." Caleb read it and then covered his face. I did not cry. I went somewhere past crying. There is a special pain in discovering that the person you lost was still protecting you from the grave, not magically, not spiritually, but practically, with ink and foresight and a sealed envelope in a library archive because she knew you would misplace courage if she left it only in your heart. Tessa apologized for not finding it sooner. I told her not to. The envelope had waited until the story needed another witness. Evelyn used Miriam's observations carefully. Not as proof of Derek's crimes, but as proof that concern about him did not begin with my supposed decline. Derek could claim I became paranoid after grief. He could not claim Miriam had written dated observations years before her death because of my later stubbornness. The letter also gave Caleb a kind of permission. He had loved his mother as much as a son can love a woman who taught him to alphabetize spices. Seeing her distrust Derek allowed him to stop treating his own suspicion as disloyalty. That is another thing manipulators steal. They make your instincts feel like betrayal. Miriam returned ours to us. One afternoon, Evelyn brought in a retired judge named Amos Bell to help prepare me for possible testimony. He was not related to Clara, though Clara claimed any decent Bell probably belonged to her somehow. Amos was 80, tall, stooped, and still terrifying in a quiet way. He sat across from me at Caleb's dining table and asked questions designed to irritate me. Mr. Cross, do you understand that your attachment to this land may be emotional rather than rational? Yes, I said. It is both. He asked whether I had ever forgotten appointments. I said everyone has, including judges. Caleb coughed into his coffee. Amos did not smile. He asked whether my refusal to sell was financially irresponsible. I said selling protected water to people who hid the buyer through a shell company was financially reckless and morally ugly. He asked whether I hated Derek. I answered too quickly. Yes. Amos lifted one eyebrow. Evelyn wrote something down. He asked again, more slowly, do you hate Derek more than you want the truth recognized? That stopped me. Hatred can be honest and still be dangerous if it becomes the loudest thing in the room. I said. No. He asked, if the truth protects the spring but does not punish Derek enough for your heart, will you still accept the result? I did not answer for a long time. Finally I said, I will try. Amos nodded. Good. Courts do not exist to satisfy the full appetite of the wounded. They exist to name enough truth that consequences can begin. I disliked him for that sentence and respected him immediately. He made me practice staying inside the question asked. Not wandering into speeches. Not defending my entire life. Not proving I was sharp by showing every sharp edge. Old men under attack often talk too much because we are trying to prove we still have all the rooms in our mind. Amos told me, you do not prove a house by opening every door at once. Open the one they ask for. That advice saved me at the Grange Hall. It saved me later in deposition. It may be the best testimony advice I ever heard. The night after Amos left, I sat on Caleb's porch while his children slept upstairs and thought about all the people now holding pieces of my survival. Evelyn with the law. Caleb with the messages. Clara with photographs. June with the first warning. Tessa with Miriam's letter. Amos with questions. Dr. Leese with capacity. Miguel and Nora with worker statements. I had spent months feeling alone inside a house full of people. Now, outside that house, I realized I was less alone than I had been willing to ask for. Pride is useful when it keeps your spine straight. It is dangerous when it keeps your mouth shut. I wish I had learned that before 74, but late lessons are still lessons. The final private meeting before the public signing happened in Caleb's kitchen. Evelyn spread the documents across the table in order. She liked order almost as much as I did, which is why I trusted her. First, independent capacity report. Second, covenant copy from county records. Third, springhouse copy photographs. Fourth, Miriam's library letter. 5th, North Star and Cascade connection. 6th, Derek's side fee evidence. 7th, Valerie's flash drive memo. 8th, guardianship draft. 9th, worker statements. 10th, recordings. 11th, formal trust activation notice. 12th, civil complaint draft. 12 piles, like the 12 observations Miriam had left. Evelyn said we might not use everything publicly. The goal was not to drown the room. The goal was to create a sequence they could not escape. I asked what happens if Derek denies all of it. Evelyn said then he will deny himself into discovery. Caleb asked what happens if the buyer backs away before the trust activates. Evelyn said then we protect the spring through injunctive relief and still proceed. Valerie, who had been sitting silently at the far end of the table, asked what happens to me. No one answered quickly. That was the first time she asked the right question without hiding inside someone else's concern. Evelyn said, that depends on what you do before and after the truth is public. Valerie nodded. She looked smaller than I remembered, but not weak. More like someone who had finally stopped borrowing Derek's size and had to learn her own. She offered to stand up at the Grange Hall and confess. Evelyn said no. Not because confession was wrong, but because Derek would immediately frame her as unstable, emotional, pressured by me. Better to let documents speak first. Better to let Derek reveal himself under pressure. Better to let Valerie's declaration arrive after his performance started to collapse. Strategy is sometimes cruel to people who want to repent loudly. It asks them to wait until repentance is useful rather than satisfying. Valerie accepted that. That acceptance counted. Before we left the table, Caleb asked me whether I was sure I wanted to attend. He said we could file everything without giving Derek a public room. I looked at the piles of paper. I thought of the brochure, the renderings, the photographs selected to make me look weak, the script written in my voice, the Grange Hall deposit under my name, the people already told I had chosen this. I said, he made the lie public. The correction has to be public too. Evelyn did not object. Amos, on speakerphone, said, then remember, Mr. Cross, do not swing at every insult. Let him carry the weight. Clara, also on speakerphone because she had refused exclusion, said, and if he runs, trip him legally. Evelyn said, Clara, please stop giving procedural advice. Clara said, make better procedures. It was the first time in weeks that everyone laughed at once. That laughter did not remove fear. It put fear in its place. The buyer revealed himself at the Harvest Preservation Luncheon, which was neither about harvest nor preservation. It was held at the old Grange Hall on a bright September afternoon. Valerie insisted I attend because the community needed to see me looking well, which is a sentence that sounds kind until you ask who benefits from the display. Derek wore a navy suit and worked the room like a candidate. Valerie stayed near me, touching my elbow whenever someone asked a direct question. Caleb drove down for the event, tired from school board politics and grateful that his sister had organized something beautiful for the orchard. That was part of the cruelty. The trap had flowers. There were framed photographs of Miriam on the tables, little cards describing Cross Orchard heritage, and a glossy brochure showing a future retreat called The Springs at Ash Hollow. My orchard appeared in the brochure without my permission, softened by renderings into something clean, profitable, and dead. The old packing shed became a tasting room. The springhouse became a wellness pavilion. The lower apple rows became villas. Miriam's wildflower strip became parking. I stood there holding that brochure while people around me ate chicken salad and said how exciting legacy can be when the next generation steps up. I looked at Valerie. Her eyes were wet. I could not tell whether from shame or strategy. Derek climbed the small stage and thanked everyone for supporting a family transition. Family transition. He said I had carried the orchard long enough. He said Valerie and Caleb were helping me protect Miriam's legacy by placing the land into professional hands. He said the purchase by Cascade Reserve Group would create jobs, restore historic structures, and provide me with lifetime care in a beautiful assisted living community designed for dignity. People clapped. Not all, but enough to make the room tilt. Caleb looked confused. He whispered, "What purchase?" Valerie gripped his wrist under the table. I saw it. He saw me see it. Then Derek invited me to stand. That was the first public rehearsal for my disappearance. I stood because refusing would make me look unstable. Derek put an arm around my shoulders and said into the microphone, "Leonard, are you ready to let us take care of you now?" The room softened. You could feel it. People love a clean story about elders being cared for by family. They do not ask who wrote the story. I leaned toward the microphone and said, "Care is a serious word, Derek. It should not be used by people who have not read the paperwork." A few people laughed because they thought I had made an old man joke. Derek's arm tightened for half a second. That was the first time I felt his fear through his hand. After the luncheon, Caleb followed me to the parking lot and asked what was going on. I told him, "Not here." He looked back at Valerie, then at Derek, then at me. For the first time, my son did not look tired. He looked awake. Caleb came to the orchard the next morning before sunrise. He found me in the springhouse with a flashlight, lifting the old floor stone Miriam had chosen 32 years earlier. The stone was heavier than I remembered, or I was older than I wanted to admit. Caleb helped without asking questions. Underneath was a rusted tin box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a paper copy of the covenant, a letter from Miriam, and a brass key I had forgotten existed. The letter was addressed to whoever tries to sell what is not theirs. That was Miriam again, polite enough to write a letter, angry enough to aim it like a knife. Caleb read it first. His face changed as he moved through the lines. Miriam had written that the spring belonged to no ambition, no creditor, no frightened heir, and no polished stranger who learned the language of legacy without understanding sacrifice. She wrote that if Leonard is living and anyone tries to move him aside with false tenderness, this document is to be treated as my living refusal. Caleb sat on the springhouse floor and cried into both hands. Not because of the legal force of it. Because Miriam had seen this shape before any of us admitted it existed. My son had trusted Valerie and Derek because he wanted family to still mean something after his mother died. He had let distance and guilt make him easy to manage. I did not blame him. Blame is a tool you use carefully or it cuts the wrong person. I showed him my notes. The survey stakes. The water rights inquiry. The elder care assessment. The recordings. The brochure. The photographs Clara had taken. Caleb said, "Why did you not tell me sooner?" I said, "Because I was afraid you would think I was exactly what they were saying I was." He looked down. That answer hurt him because it was partly true. The sweetest children can still be used by ugly stories when the story arrives through a trusted mouth. We spent the next 5 hours building a file. Caleb called a lawyer he knew from the school district, who referred us to Evelyn Hart, a land and elder rights attorney in Portland. Evelyn had a voice like dry paper and no patience for decorative outrage. She listened for 8 minutes, then said, "Do not confront them, do not sign anything, do not attend any medical evaluation they arrange, do not sleep in that house without copying every document you can access, and do not underestimate a developer who already has renderings." She drove down the next day. I liked her immediately because she did not call me dear, did not pat my arm, and did not ask whether I was overwhelmed. She asked where the original deed was, whether my wife had executed the covenant with a witness, who had current access to my email, and whether Derek had discussed me in writing. When I said probably, she smiled for the first time. People who think they are clever always write too much. That afternoon, Evelyn filed a protective notice against transfer of the water rights and requested certified copies of the original covenant. She also arranged an independent capacity evaluation with Dr. Hannah Leese, a neurologist who had no connection to Valerie, Derek, Cascade Reserve, or the elder care consultant. I passed the evaluation so thoroughly that Dr. Leese asked whether I would consider doing bookkeeping for her clinic. I told her I was busy defending a spring. The middle of any war is less dramatic than people think. It is not all confrontations and revelations. It is waiting, copying, checking, not reacting when every nerve asks for reaction. Derek sensed resistance but not the shape of it. That made him dangerous. He began tightening the house. He changed the Wi-Fi password. He said it was security. He moved my checkbooks into Valerie's desk because bills were being centralized. He told Caleb I had become paranoid after the luncheon. He brought Marion Vale back for a second assessment and this time asked questions in front of her designed to make me seem stubborn rather than clear. Leonard, do you remember agreeing that the stairs are unsafe? Leonard, do you remember leaving the springhouse open? Leonard, do you remember asking me to handle the buyer calls? Each question had a lie folded inside it. If I answered sharply, I looked irritable. If I answered slowly, I looked confused. If I refused, I looked uncooperative. I finally said, Derek, I remember enough to know you prefer questions that accuse before they ask. Marion wrote something down. Good. Let her. Evelyn had told me that false capacity cases often fail when the supposedly diminished person refuses the rhythm of the trap. Speak plainly, she said. Do not perform cleverness. Do not perform anger. Facts make better witnesses than speeches. But I am human. Some nights I stood in Miriam's old sewing room and shook with rage so hard I had to grip the windowsill. I thought of Valerie as a girl asleep on the couch with a library book open on her chest. I thought of her now, moving papers from one room to another while Derek built a sail around my living body. I wanted to hate her cleanly. I could not. Clean hate is easy. Love with damage still inside it is work. The second CTA came on the night I found Miriam's photo turned face down in Valerie's drawer, which sounds like a small thing unless you have ever watched a dead woman be hidden by the people who want her promises forgotten. I stood there holding that frame and knew we had crossed into the part of the story where silence would help the wrong people. Before I tell you what I found next, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from. If you have ever seen a family smile while hiding the truth, I want to know you are still here with me. The thing I found next was not in Valerie's drawer. It was in the trash. Derek had shredded a draft email, but not well. Controllers are patient people. I spent 2 hours with tape and tweezers reconstructing enough lines to see the words execution event, capacity optics, and elder transition narrative. I photographed each piece. Caleb wanted to confront him immediately. Evelyn said no. Clara said she would happily confront him with a shovel. Evelyn said especially no to that. Instead we waited for Derek to invite me into his final trap. Waiting did not mean doing nothing. That is something younger people often misunderstand about old men who sit quietly. They think stillness is surrender because they have never watched a trap being built by someone who knows exactly where the weight must fall. The first thing Evelyn made me do was rebuild my own life on paper. Not emotionally. Literally. Birth certificate, marriage certificate, Miriam's death certificate, original deed, mortgage release, water filings, orchard tax history, spring test results, insurance policies, medical records, bank signature cards, and every account statement for the last 10 years. She said, Leonard, when someone tries to make you disappear legally, the best answer is to become inconveniently documented. So I became inconvenient. Caleb scanned boxes until his eyes went red. Clara drove copies to the print shop because she said any conspiracy that depended on her understanding cloud storage deserved to win, and she refused to allow that. June at the diner introduced me to her nephew, who worked part-time in information technology and full-time being underestimated. He recovered an old email account that Derek had claimed was inactive. Inside were account alerts I had never seen because they had been forwarded to Valerie's address. Nothing enormous at first. Password changes. Login attempts. Document access notices. Then one alert from a file sharing service with a folder named Legacy Transition Media. That folder gave us the first version of Derek's public story. There was a draft video script. It began with my name, but not my voice. Leonard Cross has chosen to honor his late wife's dream by transferring Cross Orchard into a new community wellness model. I read that sentence 3 times. Miriam's dream. That was the part that turned my stomach. Miriam had spent half her life protecting that spring from commercial hands, and Derek planned to place her name on the ribbon when he cut it. The folder also contained photographs of me. Some were ordinary. Some were selected to make me look weak. Me leaning on the porch rail after my knee locked. Me asleep in Miriam's chair with my mouth open. Me staring at papers through reading glasses. An old man can look fragile in a photograph even when his mind is sharp enough to cut glass. That was the trick. Derek was not only preparing documents. He was preparing images. Evelyn called it visual capacity framing. Clara called it creep photography. I preferred Clara's version. There were also interview questions drafted for Valerie. Tell us how difficult this transition has been. Tell us when you first became concerned about Leonard living alone. Tell us how Miriam would feel knowing the land is being cared for. Each question contained its own answer. Each answer pushed me a little farther out of my own life. Caleb printed the questions and put them in a red folder labeled Theft with Lighting. That was the first time I heard him joke since the luncheon. Humor is not recovery, but it sometimes proves the lungs still work. Evelyn also subpoenaed communications between Cascade Reserve and North Star. She could not get everything immediately, but the notice alone shook them. Buyers do not like hidden risk. Developers like uncertainty even less than old farmers like coyotes. 2 days after the subpoena notice went out, a man from Cascade called me directly. His name was Graham Ellery, Senior Acquisitions Director, a title that sounded heavy enough to compensate for something. He said he wanted to make sure I felt respected. I told him respect usually introduces itself before renderings. He cleared his throat and said his company had been assured that family consensus existed. I asked who assured him. He said Derek had been designated as the family's transition representative. I asked by whom. He said he would have to review his notes. That answer told me the notes were bad. I told him to review them carefully because Miriam's covenant was older than his corporate enthusiasm. He went quiet. Then he said, "What covenant?" I smiled for the first time that day. Not kindly. A buyer who does not know the main encumbrance is not a partner. He is bait. Evelyn told me later that I should not have mentioned the covenant to Graham. She was right as a lawyer. I was right as a man tired of being discussed as a problem in rooms that wanted my signature. The mention forced movement. Derek came home angry that night. Not loud at first. He had learned that loud made witnesses. He found me at the kitchen table, where I had laid out old orchard invoices from the year Miriam and I replaced the north irrigation line. He stood in the doorway and said, "You are making calls now." I said, "I have owned a telephone for many years." He stepped in, closed the door behind him, and lowered his voice. "Leonard, there are people trying to help you leave this with dignity." I said, "Dignity does not usually require hiding the buyer from the owner." His face changed. Only a little. A twitch at the corner of his mouth. Then he sat across from me and put both hands flat on the table like a man preparing to explain weather to a child. "You are not seeing the full picture," he said. That phrase belongs in a museum of manipulation. The full picture always seems to be somewhere the victim is not allowed to look. He said the orchard was financially inefficient. True, if you measure only profit. He said the spring was underutilized. True, if you believe water exists to be branded. He said Miriam would want Valerie secure. Also true, but not at the cost of turning Miriam's protection into Valerie's payout. Then he said, and this is when I knew he was worried, that the alternative was guardianship. He did not threaten it like a villain. He placed it on the table like a brochure. He said Valerie did not want that. He said Caleb would be devastated. He said a court process would be humiliating for me. He said strangers would review my daily habits, my medical records, my finances. He said the public signing was a kinder path. I looked at him and thought, there it is. Not the sale. Not the money. The central lie. Obedience as kindness. He left when I did not answer. 3 minutes later, Valerie entered, pale as flour. She asked what he had said. I told her. She sat down without being invited, which she had not done in weeks. For a long time she looked at the table. Then she said, he told me guardianship was only a backup. I asked, backup for what? She did not answer. Her silence answered for her. Backup for my refusal to vanish gracefully. That night Caleb and I found the guardianship draft. It was hidden in a folder labeled pest control bids, because Derek was clever in the way a man is clever when he has never met a county controller with insomnia. The petition was not filed yet, but it was complete enough to show intent. It described me as increasingly isolated, resistant to care, financially vulnerable, and emotionally fixated on deceased spouse-centered property. I almost admired that phrase for its cruelty. Deceased spouse-centered property. My home. My orchard. Miriam's spring. All reduced to symptoms. There was an attached declaration for Valerie to sign. She had not signed it. That mattered. Beside it was another declaration prepared for Caleb, and signed. Derek had planned to pressure my son too. The petition named a professional guardian recommended by Marion Vale's agency. The guardian's company had previously handled transitions into assisted living communities owned by investors connected to Cascade's network. Evelyn traced that connection before breakfast. By noon, she had an affidavit ready. By evening, Derek had no idea that the backup plan he had threatened me with had become one more beam in the case against him. The hardest part was not gathering proof. The hardest part was living under the same roof while proof gathered around us like dry leaves. Every ordinary sound became charged. Derek's shoes in the hallway. Valerie's phone vibrating. The printer upstairs. Cabinet doors closing. Caleb's truck in the driveway. The orchard wind at night. Even the spring sounded different, not peaceful, but insistent, as if it were repeating Miriam's instruction until I finally obeyed. I moved my important papers into a locked metal box and hid the key inside the hollow handle of an old pruning saw. I left harmless copies in the office drawer because Evelyn said people looking for documents feel calmer when they find something. Derek did find them. I knew because one corner of the drawer was not aligned exactly with the tape mark I had placed beneath it. Controllers and engineers share a vice. We notice lines. The next morning he was pleasant. That told me he had found the harmless copies and believed he had mapped my defense. A man who underestimates you is sometimes doing you a favor. Valerie became quieter. She stopped meeting Derek's eyes at dinner. Once, while he spoke about moving my bedroom to the ground floor for safety, she gripped her fork so tightly her knuckles went white. I wanted to rescue her from him. Then I remembered she had helped build the room we were sitting in. Both truths can stand at once. That is the cruelty of family betrayal. The person may be trapped and still have helped set the snare. One evening she came to the porch after Derek left for a buyer dinner. She carried 2 mugs of tea, though I had not drunk tea since Miriam died. She set one beside me anyway. For a minute we watched the orchard darken. Then she said, "Do you remember when I was 16 and I backed your truck into the lower fence?" I said, "You told me a deer did it." She laughed once, a small broken sound. "You said it was an unusually licensed deer." I smiled despite myself. She looked at me then and said, "I miss that version of us." I answered too quickly. Then stop helping him erase it. She closed her eyes. I regretted the sharpness but not the truth. When she opened them, she said, I do not know how to leave a man who knows every weak thing about me. That sentence did what crying had not. It made me see the cage around her more clearly. Derek had used greed, yes, but he had also used shame. He knew her debts, her fear of being ordinary, her resentment at being Miriam's daughter and not Miriam, her private belief that I had loved the orchard more steadily than I had loved her. Some of that belief was unfair. Some had roots. Parents rarely get to defend themselves without discovering places where the accusation found real soil. I told Valerie, he knows weak things about you because you gave them to him when you thought they were safe. That does not make him their owner. She cried then. Not quietly, not prettily. The sound came out of her like something old breaking. I did not touch her. I wanted to. I did not. She needed to learn that comfort and rescue are not the same. When Derek came home, she was upstairs. I was still on the porch with 2 cold mugs of tea. He looked at them, then at me. His smile was thin. Family evening, he said. I said, something like that. 2 days before the invitation arrived, Derek tried the hospital route. It was elegant in its ugliness. He loosened the runner at the top of the back stairs, not enough to be obvious, enough to catch a foot. I know because I had tightened that runner myself 3 months earlier and because the screw heads had fresh marks. At 5 in the morning I came down by the front stairs instead, because a lifetime in old houses teaches you to distrust new silence. Derek found the untouched runner at breakfast and looked confused for less than a second. Later that morning, Valerie said maybe I should use only the downstairs rooms for a while. I asked why. She said stairs were dangerous. I asked which stairs. She looked toward Derek before she could stop herself. That glance went into my notebook. So did the runner. So did the screw marks. Clara photographed them with a ruler beside each screw because she had started watching crime shows and believed evidence needed scale. Evelyn did not laugh when I sent the photographs. She called immediately and said, Leonard, sleep at Caleb's tonight. I refused. Not bravely. Stubbornly. Sometimes those are cousins. Evelyn said, then at least put a chair under your bedroom door. I did. I also set my old county recorder on the dresser and left it running. At 2:13 in the morning, the bedroom knob turned. Once. Slowly. Then stopped against the chair. No knock. No voice. Just pressure against wood. In the morning Derek said he had been checking whether I was all right because he heard me coughing. I had not coughed. I played the recording for Evelyn and Caleb in the springhouse because I did not trust the kitchen anymore. Caleb went white with anger. He said, he came into your room. I said, he tried. There is a difference, and differences matter in court. Caleb wanted me out of the house that day. Evelyn agreed. Clara agreed. June agreed when she heard, despite not being invited to the decision. I still resisted until Valerie came to the springhouse alone with a canvas bag. She handed it to me. Inside was Miriam's old cookbook, the green one with loose pages and sauce stains on the cover. I asked why she was giving it to me. Valerie said, because Derek never opens anything that looks like work. Inside the cookbook, between Miriam's recipe for blackberry cobbler and a page titled Apple Butter for Patient People, Valerie had hidden a small flash drive. On it were emails, drafts, and one recorded voice memo Derek had sent her by accident, then asked her to delete. She had not. That was the moment Valerie crossed the line from fear into evidence. The voice memo was Derek speaking to someone named Graham, saying the old man will not survive a contested process emotionally, and if he does, the daughter can carry the family consent narrative. I listened once. Caleb listened twice. Evelyn listened and said, enough. That night I slept at Caleb's house for the first time. I hated leaving my own bed. I hated Derek sitting under my roof. But war sometimes requires retreating from a room so the whole house can be saved. At Caleb's house, my grandchildren treated me like a visiting dignitary and a fragile appliance at the same time. Emma, 12, made a sign for the guest room door that said Grandpa's office because she had heard adults say I needed to keep working. Noah, 9, asked whether Derek was a bad guy or a complicated guy. I told him most bad guys are complicated, and that does not make them less responsible. He thought about that over cereal and said, so complicated is not an excuse. Correct, I said. He nodded, pleased to have acquired a rule. Children deserve clear rules. Adults keep trying to make harmful behavior. Mysterious because mystery feels kinder than naming. It is not kinder. It is only slower. Caleb and I used those days to prepare for the signing. Evelyn wanted a public reveal only if we could control the legal consequences. She said humiliation without structure is just noise. So the structure became precise. First, let Derek introduce the sale publicly. Second, let him connect care and transfer in his own words. Third, present independent capacity. Fourth, present the covenant. Fifth, present the recordings. Sixth, serve civil notice. Seventh, trigger the trust through formal written objection and evidence of coercive transfer attempt. Eighth, keep me calm enough that no one could use my reaction against me. That eighth step was the hardest. Not because I am a hothead. Because calm in the face of intimate betrayal costs more than anger. Anger gives the body somewhere to put the fire. Calm asks it to burn clean. Evelyn rehearsed questions with me. Derek says this is about your care. Answer. My care does not require a secret buyer. Derek says you agreed privately. Answer. Show the document. Derek says Miriam would approve. Answer. Miriam already spoke in the covenant. Derek says you are confused. Answer. Dr. Leese evaluated me independently. Derek says you are bitter. Answer. Correct, but still accurate. Evelyn told me not to use that last answer. Caleb liked it. Clara loved it. Dr. Lee submitted a letter stating I understood the nature of my assets, the proposed transfer, the legal risks, and the family dynamics at issue. She also added, in careful medical language, that pressure from interested parties appeared to be a greater threat to my welfare than independent residence. I read that sentence aloud 3 times. Sometimes professionals can say with clean hands what family members have been screaming in silence. The night before the signing, Valerie came to Caleb's house. She stood on the porch in the rain with no umbrella, holding another envelope. Caleb almost did not let her in. I said, let her. She was shaking. Inside the envelope was the final sale script Derek had written for her. Her lines were marked in yellow. Mine were marked in blue, though I had never seen them. The last line assigned to me was, I am ready to rest and let my family carry this gift forward. I stared at that sentence and felt something colder than anger. They had written my surrender in my voice. Valerie said, I was supposed to practice it with you in the car tomorrow. I asked, why are you bringing it now? She said, because I heard my mother's voice in my head asking when I became this small. That was Miriam's other trap. Not legal. Maternal. Still working. The invitation came in a cream envelope placed beside my coffee cup on a Monday morning. Derek watched me open it. Valerie stood at the sink pretending to rinse a clean bowl. It was a formal invitation to the Cross Orchard Legacy signing, scheduled for Thursday evening at the Grange Hall. Media welcome. Community partners welcome. Cascade Reserve Group welcome. Family remarks by Leonard Cross. The arrogance of it almost impressed me. He had created an event where refusal itself would be used as evidence against me. If I did not attend, I was unstable. If I attended and refused to sign, I was confused or hostile. If I attended and signed, he won. The sale contract in the blue folder listed $28.6 million, but that number was only the public price. Evelyn's investigation had found a side agreement. Derek would receive a consulting fee through a company he controlled. Valerie would receive a relocation trust. Marion Vale's agency would receive a long-term care placement fee. North Star Hospitality Renewal was just Cascade Reserve with a paper bag over its head. They were not just selling my orchard. They were dividing the pieces of my removal. The day before the signing, Valerie came to me in the packing shed. She looked exhausted. Not guilty in the theatrical way. Worn. Derek had been shouting again. Clara had heard enough through the open window to text me, "Your son-in-law is auditioning for hell." Valerie stood among crates that still smelled faintly of apples and dust. She said, "Dad, what would it take for you to make this easier? Not what would make you happy. Not what do you want. Easier." I asked, easier for who? She closed her eyes. For everyone. I said, Miriam never trusted that word when someone used it while holding someone else's property. Valerie flinched. For a second, I saw the girl under the woman. Then she said something that told me Derek had not shared everything with her. He says the spring rights are clean. I said, who told him that? She looked at me. No one speaks that carefully unless a missing answer has just appeared. I did not tell her about the covenant. Not yet. Mercy is not the same as foolishness. I said, Valerie, if you are still inside this by Thursday night, you may not be able to step out clean. She whispered, I do not know where clean is anymore. Then she left. That sentence saved her later. Not legally, not entirely. But in my heart it kept one small room from burning down. Thursday arrived cold and bright. I wore my dark suit, the one from Miriam's funeral, because there are only so many ceremonies where a man is expected to bury part of his life. Caleb drove with me. Evelyn rode separately with 2 associates and a sealed packet of documents. Clara sat in the back of the hall with June from the diner and 3 orchard workers who had known me longer than Derek had known the valley existed. Dr. Lee sat near the aisle. She looked calm. Lawyers, good ones, understand theater better than actors. Derek had arranged the stage beautifully. A banner read honoring the past, growing the future. There were flowers. There were cameras. There was a table with the blue folder placed in the center like an altar. Derek opened the event with a speech about legacy. Men like Derek love that word because it lets them steal in future tense. He thanked Valerie for courage, Caleb for support, and me for trusting the next generation. Caleb's face did not move. Valerie looked like she might be sick. Then Derek called me up. The room clapped. I walked slowly, not because I needed to, but because age can be a weapon if people have mistaken it for weakness. Derek placed the pen in my hand. The cameras leaned closer. He smiled for them and whispered, "Be gracious, Leonard." I looked at the contract. I looked at the audience. I looked at Valerie. Then I said into the microphone, before I sign anything, I want to thank Derek for being so thorough. He smiled wider. He thought I was surrendering. I continued, he arranged the buyer, the medical narrative, the elder placement, the public event, the consulting fee, and even the language explaining why I should no longer manage the affairs I have managed successfully for decades. The room shifted. Not loudly. Rooms have bodies. They tighten when truth enters without asking permission. Derek's smile held for half a second too long. Valerie whispered, "Dad." I said, "No, let us be transparent. This is a legacy event, after all." Evelyn Hart stood from the second row. She announced herself as my attorney and presented the independent capacity evaluation. Clear cognition. No evidence of dementia. No evidence of impaired executive function. Full legal capacity. Derek interrupted, saying this was not the place. Evelyn said, "You chose the place." Caleb stepped up next and placed the covenant copy on the table. I watched Derek's eyes drop to the signature page. He saw Miriam's name. Then mine. Then Samuel Pike's notary seal. He did not understand yet, but he felt the floor move. I explained it myself because some punishments deserve plain language. The spring rights cannot be sold under private pressure. If any household family member attempts to force a transfer by fraud, concealed buyer interest, false capacity pressure, or coercion, the rights pass into the Miriam Cross Public Spring Trust for 99 years. The buyer representative stood. His face had changed from polished to pale. Derek said, "That document is obsolete." Evelyn said. "Recorded, active, and now triggered." That was the sound of $28.6 million falling through a hole Derek had never seen. He turned to Valerie. She had both hands over her mouth. He turned to the buyer. The buyer stepped away from him as if greed were contagious. Then the final piece opened. Evelyn played the recording from my kitchen, the one where Derek told Valerie that if I refused, they would lean harder on the decline angle and push the court order before I could gather old friends around me. His voice filled the Grange hall. Smooth. Impatient. Familiar. Then came Valerie's voice, small and shaking, asking whether this was still about protecting me. Derek answered, "It is about controlling the asset before your father makes it impossible. There are sentences a marriage cannot survive." That was one of them. Derek tried to leave the stage. He did not get far. Not because anyone tackled him. This was not that kind of story. He was stopped by paper, which is often more humiliating to men who worship contracts. Evelyn served him with notice of civil claims for elder financial exploitation, attempted coercive transfer, fraud in the inducement, and interference with protected water rights. The buyer's counsel served him with a notice of breach tied to undisclosed encumbrances. Cascade Reserve had believed Derek controlled the family side of the transaction. He had sold them confidence without checking the stone under the springhouse floor. The County Water Board representative, whom Evelyn had invited quietly, announced that the trust activation would be reviewed the following morning. June from the diner said, loud enough for 3 rows to hear, "I hope the wellness pavilion has good drainage because this man is sinking fast." I should not have laughed. I did. Valerie walked off the stage and did not go to Derek. She came to me. For 7 years after Miriam's death, I had imagined many forms of justice. Derek exposed. The orchard saved. The spring protected. What I had not imagined was Valerie standing in front of me under those terrible fluorescent lights, looking like the girl who once asked whether stepfathers in fairy tales were useless. She said, "I am sorry." I told her, not yet. Not because I rejected her. Because apology offered at the center of collapse can be another way of asking the injured person to hold you upright. I was too old for that and finally wise enough to know it. She nodded. That nod mattered. She understood. Derek did not. He shouted that I had manipulated everyone, that Miriam had been vindictive, that I was destroying generational wealth out of spite. Generational wealth. The phrase almost made me admire the audacity. He had been in my family long enough to confuse proximity with inheritance. The cameras caught all of it. His shouting. The buyer retreating. Valerie crying. Caleb standing beside me. Evelyn closing her folder. Dr. Lee speaking calmly to a reporter about weaponized concern. By midnight, the clip had moved through the county. By morning, it had reached Portland. By the following week, Cascade Reserve terminated the agreement and filed against Derek's consulting company for misrepresentation. Marion Vale's agency was under state review. North Star Hospitality renewal disappeared from its own website. Derek's credit lines froze. His investors wanted explanations he could not provide without confessing to the very scheme he denied. The spring trust activated. That was the sweetest part, not because I lost something, but because Miriam won. The water rights passed beyond sale for 99 years. I kept the house and a life estate over the orchard. The lower rows became protected. The packing shed could still be used for harvest, education, and community events, but not for villas, wellness suites, bottled water branding, or any other polished theft-wearing linen. The buyer's $28.6 million vanished. Derek's side fee vanished. The relocation trust vanished. The assisted living placement vanished. Every path they had built required me to be smaller than I was. The covenant made me larger than they knew how to fight. For the first week after Derek left, I expected to feel free every time I opened my eyes. Instead, I woke up angry that the coffee was not enough to fix anything. Freedom after pressure is strange. You think it will feel like open sky, but often it feels like inventory. What was moved? What was broken? What did I fail to see? What must be repaired first? I made lists. Some were practical. Change locks. Remove Derek's cameras. Restore email access. Close Valerie's recovery contact permissions. Review bank authorizations. Inspect stairs. Replace the office drawer lock. Some lists were not practical at all. Why did I ignore Miriam? Why did Valerie choose silence? Why did Caleb believe concern faster than he believed my anger? Why did I let a man who did not love the orchard use the word legacy inside my house? Evelyn told me the second kind of list is dangerous if you try to finish it too quickly. Some accounts take years to reconcile. I did not like that. Controllers prefer reconciliation by month end. Grief and betrayal do not respect fiscal calendars. Valerie spent her 30 days sorting through what remained. She found receipts for payments Derek had made from her account to Marion Vale's agency. She found a draft prenuptial amendment giving Derek control over proceeds from family-connected property transactions. She found messages where he mocked Caleb as the guilt brother and me as the signature problem. That phrase became famous in our little circle. Clara put it on a sticky note and stuck it to a jar of slugs she had trapped in the greenhouse. Signature problem, she said, meet garden problem. The woman has her methods. Valerie also found a note Derek had written to himself on hotel stationery from a buyer meeting. It said, do not let V talk alone with L before signing. V softens near the old man. V softens. That was how he described his wife, remembering she had a father. When Valerie read it, she sat down on the kitchen floor and did not move for several minutes. I stood in the doorway. Caleb stood behind me. Neither of us knew whether to comfort her. Finally she looked up and said, he studied me. I said, yes. She said, and I called it love. I said nothing. Some conclusions must finish themselves in the person who needs them. The divorce was ugly because Derek had very little left except cruelty, and he spent it freely. He claimed Valerie had been manipulated by me and Caleb. He claimed she stole documents. He claimed she had always resented my property and had invented his role to protect her inheritance. Every accusation was a mirror he refused to recognize. Valerie did not answer publicly. Evelyn answered legally. There is a difference, and the legal answer was better. By the time the divorce court saw the emails, the recordings, and Derek's side fee documents, his claim to victimhood had gone limp. Valerie walked out of that courthouse with no dramatic triumph, just a plastic folder, red eyes, and her married name already feeling like a coat she could not wait to remove. The orchard workers returned before the legal case ended. That mattered more than I expected. During Derek's last months in the house, he had reduced their hours, saying the future model would not need old labor patterns. Old labor patterns meant men and women who knew which trees leaned after storms, which valves stuck, where the ground softened after rain, and when I was walking slower because my knee had had enough. He had treated them as expenses. They returned as witnesses to continuity. Miguel came first, carrying pruning shears and a bag of oranges his sister had sent from California. He said, "Mr. Cross, the South Row looks insulted." That was his way of saying he was glad to be back. Nora arrived next with gloves and no patience for ceremony. She had worked harvest since she was 17 and could outpick men half her age. She hugged me hard enough to make my ribs complain, then said, "Do not ever let a man in loafers make tree decisions again." I promised. We worked the orchard back into shape one row at a time. Caleb brought his students one Saturday for volunteer hours. They expected a simple service project. I gave them a lecture on irrigation history first because I am still myself. Emma told me afterward that I made water rights sound like a murder mystery. I took that as praise. The students cleared brush, painted crates, and asked whether Derek had really tried to turn the spring into a spa. Noah said, "Not a spa, a villain fountain." Children understand more than adults credit them for, and they name things better. The first harvest after the trust activated was not large, but it felt ceremonial. We pressed cider in the old shed, the one Derek had wanted to turn into a tasting room with polished concrete and imported pendant lights. Instead we had sticky floors, paper cups, county folding tables, and a line of neighbors stretching out the door. June brought pie. Clara sold plants from the back of her truck and donated half to the trust because she said the other half was for pain and suffering caused by fools. Valerie came late and stood near the edge, unsure where she belonged. Miriam's photograph sat on a table beside the trust documents. Not as decoration. As witness. I saw Valerie look at it. She did not cry. She walked over, straightened the frame, and stepped back. That was enough for that day. Later, as the sun dropped behind the lower trees, Caleb handed me a paper cup of cider. He said, "Mom would have complained that the signage was crooked." I said, "And then fixed it herself." We both looked toward the banner. It was crooked. Neither of us moved. Some imperfections deserve to live a while. The aftermath did not feel like victory at first. It felt like weather after a storm, when branches are down, windows are cracked, and the sky is blue in a way that almost feels rude. Derek left the house that same night with 2 suitcases and a phone that would not stop ringing. Valerie did not leave with him. She slept in Miriam's sewing room, or tried to. I found her there at 4 in the morning sitting on the floor under the window. She said, "I knew some of it. Not all. But enough." I said, "I know." She said, "I told myself he was making things easier." I said, "I know." She said, "I let him use my worry about you." I said, "Yes." That was the first honest word between us in a long time. Yes. Not comfort. Not forgiveness. Accuracy. Caleb wanted her gone by breakfast. He had earned his anger. I did not correct it. But I gave Valerie 30 days. Not because she deserved softness. Because the house needed a clean ending, not another midnight removal. During those 30 days, she wrote statements for Evelyn, turned over emails, testified to the state investigator, and signed a declaration acknowledging that I had never consented to the sale, never agreed to assisted living, and never authorized Derek to speak for the orchard. She also found what Derek had hidden in a cloud folder under her name. Draft petitions for emergency guardianship. A proposed media statement about my declining health. A letter to Caleb prepared for Valerie to send after the sale, saying the decision had been mine and the process had been peaceful. That letter hurt Caleb more than anything. It used phrases only a sibling would know. Childhood references. Miriam's favorite pie. The time he broke his wrist falling from the packing shed roof. Derek had planned to use family memory as wrapping paper for fraud. Caleb printed that letter and stared at it for 10 minutes. Then he tore it exactly in half, not from top to bottom, but through Derek's signature block. My son has always been quiet. Quiet anger has its own grammar. Derek was charged months later after the state investigation widened. I will not pretend the legal process moved like lightning. It moved like law, which is slower and duller and more important than revenge fantasies like to admit. Elder exploitation. Attempted fraud. Forged supporting statements. False representations to a buyer. Misuse of medical concern for financial gain. Marion Vale lost her license after investigators found she had tailored assessments for family-funded placements more than once. Cascade Reserve settled with the Spring Trust and paid enough to restore the old irrigation channels, repair the packing shed, and fund a public education program named after Miriam. Derek took a plea after the buyer's lawyers found his side fee documents. The judge asked whether he had anything to say. Derek said he had only wanted to secure a future for the family. I almost stood up. Evelyn touched my sleeve, and I stayed seated. The judge looked at him and said, "You tried to secure a future by removing the person who built the past you were selling." That sentence did not heal anything, but it was good to hear a stranger say it clearly. The water board hearing came before Derek's criminal plea, and in some ways it mattered more to me. Criminal court was about what he had done. The water board was about what would happen to the spring after everyone stopped being fascinated by the scandal. It was held in a county meeting room with bad carpet, a flag in the corner, and a row of microphones that made every cough sound like testimony. The board members had packets thick enough to discourage casual understanding. Evelyn sat beside me. Caleb sat behind me. Valerie sat 2 rows back, not with us, not against us, just present. That was the right place for her then. Graham Ellery from Cascade Reserve appeared with 2 lawyers and the face of a man who had discovered local water law was less decorative than he hoped. Derek was not there. His attorney sent a statement calling the covenant's activation punitive and commercially unreasonable. The board chair read that phrase aloud, then looked over her glasses as if she had smelled something spoiled. Commercially unreasonable. I thought of Miriam hearing that and asking whether greed had finally hired a poet. The hearing lasted 4 hours. Experts spoke about aquifer recharge, protected flow, historical use, educational access, and the legal meaning of coercive transfer attempt. It could have been dull, and to some people it probably was. To me, it was beautiful. Not because I understood every technical note, though I understood enough, but because the spring was being discussed as a living public concern instead of a hidden asset in Derek's pitch deck. At one point Graham's lawyer asked whether the trust activation deprived the family of economic opportunity. The tribal hydrology advisor on the board, a woman named Maren Cloud, answered before anyone else. She said, "Not every opportunity deserves to survive contact with water." The room went quiet. I wrote that line down. Later I told her Miriam would have loved it. Maren said, "Then Miriam had sense." The board voted to recognize the trust activation. Unanimous. The spring rights moved beyond commercial transfer. The orchard restrictions entered the public record. The buyer could not revive the deal, Derek could not pledge anything against it, Valerie could not inherit her way around it, Caleb could not change it later if some future emergency made him foolish, and I could not undo it on a lonely night if someone offered me enough money to confuse comfort with wisdom. That last part matters. Good promises should protect us not only from villains, but from our own future weakness. When the vote passed, I felt something inside me loosen. Not joy exactly. More like a valve releasing pressure after years of strain. Evelyn squeezed my wrist once. Caleb put his forehead down against the bench in front of him. Valerie cried silently. Graham Ellery packed his documents with the stiff hands of a man whose expensive certainty had just been outvoted by a dead librarian's caution. Outside, rain had started. Light rain. Oregon rain. The kind that seems less like weather than a long conversation with gravity. I stood under the awning and let it touch my face. Caleb asked if I wanted the car. I said no. For a minute I just wanted to stand in water that no one was trying to bottle. The deposition months were harder than the public hearing because they were designed to make truth tired. Derek's attorneys asked the same questions in different coats. Did I hate him? Did I understand the offer? Had I ever forgotten names? Had Miriam been emotionally extreme about the spring? Had Caleb influenced me? Had Evelyn coached me? Had Valerie always been financially anxious? Did I know the difference between a protected trust and personal control? Did I resent the idea of a wellness resort because I disliked change? They asked until the carpet pattern in the conference room began to feel personal. Amos had warned me. They are not always looking for answers, he said. Sometimes they are looking for fatigue. So I answered as if balancing accounts. Yes. No. I do not recall that wording. Show me the document. That is not accurate. That is accurate but incomplete. Ask the question without assuming the answer. Evelyn looked pleased every time I said that last one. Valerie's deposition lasted 2 days. She called me afterward and said, I understand now why you kept notes. I asked what happened. She said, they tried to make me sound like I had no mind of my own unless I agreed with Derek. I said, did you? She said, for a while, yes. Then she said, not anymore. That was another shard cleared from the floor. Caleb's deposition made him angry enough to split wood for 3 hours afterward. Derek's attorney suggested his involvement was motivated by future inheritance. Caleb said, my inheritance was nearly sold by a man who wanted to call my father incompetent. If protecting my father also protects future family property, I can live with the moral complexity. The court reporter asked him to repeat that because she could not type while smiling. We all changed during that process. Not in grand ways. In practical ways. Caleb learned to distrust summaries and ask for source documents. Valerie learned to stop using soft phrases when hard ones were true. I learned that being calm does not mean being mild. Evelyn learned that Clara should not be allowed in waiting rooms where opposing counsel can hear her comments. Clara, for her part, learned nothing and considered that a strength. During one break, Derek passed me in the hallway. No lawyers beside us for 3 seconds. He looked thinner, but not humbled. Some men mistake consequence for unfair weather. He said, you must be proud. I said, of Miriam, yes. His face twisted. You hid behind a dead woman. I said, no, Derek. You tripped over one. He walked away. It was not the most mature sentence I ever spoke, but I do not regret it. There was also the question of the house itself. For months after Derek left, I kept finding his improvements, and every one felt like a fingerprint. Smart thermostats connected to an account I did not control. A hidden camera in the entry shelf facing the stairs. A second router behind the television. A folder of scanned personal documents under Valerie's old laptop profile. Contractor estimates saved with notes like after L relocation. L, not Leonard. L, initials are how people make a human being easier to move around a spreadsheet. Caleb wanted to rip out everything at once. I made him slow down. We photographed, listed, preserved, then removed. The thermostat went first. I replaced it with a simple dial model that would have insulted Derek's sense of progress. The hidden camera went into an evidence bag. The router went to Evelyn. The contractor estimates became part of the civil claim. The entry shelf stayed, but I sanded it down myself because I could not stand the idea of Derek's device having watched my house from inside what Miriam had polished. That may sound irrational. It probably was. Healing is allowed some irrational carpentry. The kitchen took longest. That was where the blue folder had landed. Where Valerie had stood at the sink. Where Caleb had held the pen he did not want me to sign. Where Derek had looked through me and seen only an obstacle. For weeks I ate in the sitting room. Then one morning I woke angry at myself for giving the kitchen to a memory of him. I made coffee, carried Miriam's photograph to the counter, and cooked eggs badly, because Miriam had been the egg expert. I ate standing up. It was not pleasant. It was necessary. After breakfast I washed the pan, dried it, and placed it exactly where it belonged. Occupation ends through repeated ordinary acts. You take back a room by using it without apology. By winter, I could sit at the kitchen table again. The first time Valerie came for coffee there, she hesitated in the doorway. I said, either come in or do not, but do not haunt it. She came in. We sat across from each other. No blue folder. No Derek. No script. Just coffee and the awkward remains of love. She said, I do not know how to be your daughter now. I said, start by not trying to manage me. She nodded. Then she asked whether I wanted more coffee instead of getting up to pour it without asking. That small question did more for me than a dozen dramatic apologies. Consent returns in small domestic forms first. Coffee. Doors. Papers. Chairs. The right to say no to help without having your no treated as a symptom. The trust dedication was held the following April under a sky so clear it felt staged by someone with no respect for subtlety. We set up chairs near the springhouse. Not too many. I did not want a festival. Miriam hated fuss unless it involved children reading poems, and even then she preferred them short. The school sent a choir. Clara brought marigolds, predictably crooked. June brought 6 pies and said grief burns calories, which was medically suspicious but emotionally generous. Evelyn came in a blue coat and stood with Amos Bell, who pretended he was there for legal interest and not because he enjoyed watching Derek's failure become municipal infrastructure. Valerie arrived last, carrying Miriam's old library nameplate. She had found it in a box of things the library returned after the archive cleaning. The nameplate read Miriam Cross, head librarian. The brass was scratched. Valerie asked if we could place it inside the springhouse. I looked at Caleb. He looked at me. We both knew this was not about decoration. It was about Valerie asking to return her mother's name to a protected place after nearly letting Derek use that name as bait. I said yes. During the dedication, I spoke for less than 5 minutes, which June later called a miracle and Caleb called evidence of legal growth. I said the spring had taught us that protection is not the opposite of generosity. The spring was now protected so it could remain generous. Children would learn there. The orchard would keep working. Emergency water planning would include it. No one would own it tightly enough to ruin it. Then Valerie stepped forward without being scheduled. Evelyn shifted like she might stop her, but I shook my head. Valerie faced the small crowd and said, my mother believed stories should be returned to their proper shelves. For a while, I helped put this one in the wrong place. I am sorry. That was all. She stepped back. No performance. No demand. I saw several people soften toward her. I did too, though I did not make a display of it. Later we placed the nameplate inside the springhouse above the shelf where the school groups kept notebooks. Valerie touched the brass once, then lowered her hand. The spring moved over stone. The children were already bored and chasing one another near the pear trees. Life, which had been waiting politely through ceremony, resumed without asking permission. That evening, after everyone left, I returned alone to the springhouse. The nameplate caught the last light. Miriam Cross, head librarian. I said, you got your public trust, Miriam. Then I added, and your daughter is trying. I do not claim the water answered. But it kept moving, and some days that is answer enough. Valerie's ending was quieter, which made it harder. She moved into a small rental above Clara's nursery and took a job keeping books for a farm cooperative. Clara said hiring her was either Christian charity or poor judgment, and she was willing to let God decide which. Valerie came to see me once a week. At first, we did not hug. We drank coffee on the porch and talked about practical things. The roof. The trust. Caleb's children. Her divorce. Sometimes she cried. Sometimes I wanted to tell her it was all right. It was not all right. Forgiveness is not a rug you throw over broken glass so everyone can walk comfortably. It is more like clearing the floor one shard at a time, and some pieces hide under furniture for years. One afternoon, 3 months after the Grange Hall, she brought me Miriam's photograph. The one Derek had removed from the sitting room during the staging of the house. Valerie had found it in a storage box with brochures and buyer materials. Miriam's face was dusty behind the glass. Valerie placed it on the porch table and said, "I should have protected her place in this house." I said, "Yes." Another yes. She flinched, then nodded. The next week she came back with a new frame she bought herself, plain walnut, not expensive. We hung the photograph in the sitting room where the morning light touched it but did not fade it. That was not forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Caleb and I repaired the springhouse that summer. We replaced the warped boards, cleaned the stone channel, and put a small brass plaque near the door. It read Miriam Cross Public Spring Trust, protected water, protected memory. I argued against the plaque at first because Miriam hated being made official in metal. Caleb said she would tolerate it if it annoyed Derek forever. He had a point. School groups began visiting in the fall. Children stood by the spring while I explained water rights in language that made their teachers look politely trapped. Miriam would have loved that too. She believed children should know where water comes from, where stories come from, and where adults hide the truth when they think no one small is watching. The final CTA belongs here because this is the part people mistake for a soft ending, when really it is the most important part. If you stayed with me this far, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and write in the comments where you are watching from. Tell me whether you think Leonard should forgive Valerie fully, because stories like this do not end when the villain leaves the room. They end slowly, in the choices people make afterward. A year after the signing event, I walked down to the spring before sunrise. The orchard was silver with fog. The trees looked like old men standing shoulder to shoulder, stubborn and half asleep. I lifted the springhouse latch with the brass key from Miriam's tin box. Water moved over stone with that small constant sound that had outlasted every speech, every contract, every threat. I sat on the threshold and drank coffee from a dented thermos. Black. Always black. Caleb would arrive later with his children. Valerie might come in the afternoon, if courage held. Clara had promised to bring marigolds. June had promised pie. Evelyn had promised nothing, which from a lawyer is a form of mercy. I thought about the morning the blue folder appeared on my kitchen table. $28.6 million in clean paper. A pen waiting for my hand. My stepdaughter telling me to practice smiling. My son's hurt silence. Derek by the door, certain that the old man had no move left except surrender or embarrassment. He had been wrong because Miriam had loved me with her eyes open. He had been wrong because I kept records. He had been wrong because a waitress listened, a neighbor watched, a son returned, an attorney read, and a dead woman wrote a clause sharp enough to cut through greed 32 years later. People ask me sometimes whether the revenge was worth losing private ownership of the spring rights. That question misunderstands ownership. I never owned that water in the way Derek wanted to own it. I was its caretaker for a while. Miriam knew that. The trust did not take the spring from me. It took the spring away from people who thought I could be pressured into turning it into a product. That was the revenge. Not Derek in court. Not the cameras. Not the buyer. Walking away. Those were consequences. The revenge was watching their entire plan require my weakness, then watching it fail because Miriam and I had built protection into the ground before they ever learned to pronounce legacy. The revenge was letting Derek walk onto a public stage, with flowers and cameras and a contract, believing he had arranged my disappearance, only to discover that he had arranged the activation of the very clause that destroyed his deal. He signed his own failure by pushing too hard. He made his greed official. He taught the whole room where to look. I am 75 now. Cross Orchard is smaller in some legal ways and larger in every way that matters. The lower rows are protected. The spring is public trust water. The house is still mine while I live, and after that it becomes the education center. Miriam once joked the orchard should have been all along. Caleb visits more. He still apologizes sometimes for not seeing the scheme sooner. I tell him guilt is useful only if it teaches your eyes to stay open next time. Valerie and I are not healed, but we are honest more often than before. That counts. Derek is gone from our daily life, which is less satisfying than fiction promised and more peaceful than I expected. Peace is not dramatic. It does not kick down doors. It arrives as a morning where no one asks you to sign anything, no one moves your papers, no one speaks to you slowly to make you doubt your own mind, and the coffee tastes like coffee instead of preparation for battle. If you are listening to this because someone in your family is smiling while moving pieces of your life, hear me. Do not ignore small changes. Do not laugh off strange documents. Do not let concern become a leash. Keep copies. Ask questions. Call the person they do not want you to call. And if someone tells you that resisting them proves you are confused, write down the date, the time, and the exact words. Truth loves detail. Lies prefer fog. Miriam used to say water remembers who protects it. I used to think that was poetry. Now I know it was instruction. Protect what carries life. Protect the people who built with you. Protect your own name on the page. And when someone places a pen in your hand and tells you to smile while they take what you love, you have the right to set the pen down, look them in the eye, and ask whether they checked what was written under the stone. There is one more part of the story I need to tell, because without it the ending sounds cleaner than it felt. The week after the Grange Hall event, reporters started calling the house. Some were respectful. Some were hungry. One asked whether I felt betrayed by modern family values, which is the kind of question that tells you the caller already wrote the headline and only needs your pain to season it. I declined most interviews. Evelyn said silence could protect me, but controlled truth could protect the trust. So we agreed to one local paper interview on the porch. Caleb sat to my left. Valerie was not present. I insisted on that. Not to shame her, but because the story was still too raw for her presence to be used as decoration. The reporter asked what I wanted people to learn. I said, elder abuse does not always look like bruises. Sometimes it looks like helpful folders, arranged appointments, polite sons-in-law, and daughters who say they are only worried. Sometimes the cage is built from concern. The reporter stopped writing for a second. Then she wrote that down slowly. That line traveled farther than I expected. Letters came from people I did not know. A retired farmer in Idaho whose nephew had tried to move equipment titles. A woman in Maine whose sister used memory worries to gain bank access. A man in Arizona whose son sold a vacation cabin after convincing him the taxes were unpaid. Every letter had the same shape. I thought I was being difficult. I thought maybe they were right. I thought love meant not making trouble. That is what made me angriest after the legal dust settled. Derek had not invented the weapon. He had used a weapon. Already lying around in too many families, the idea that old people must prove they deserve control over their own lives while younger people get praised for taking it. Miriam would have been furious. Not loud furious. Library furious. The kind that makes committees regret existing. I started speaking at county elder rights workshops, not because I enjoy microphones, but because a man who survives a trap has some obligation to describe its teeth. I brought copies of harmless-looking documents and showed people where danger hides. Recovery contacts. Joint access language. Medical release wording. Emergency placement provisions. Undisclosed buyer agency. Capacity narratives. I told them not to sign anything on a bad day, not even for a child, especially not for a child who brings someone else into the room to explain why there is no time to wait. A woman came up after one workshop and pressed both hands around mine. She said, "My son keeps telling me I am making things harder by asking for copies." I told her, "Then ask twice." She laughed and cried at the same time. That is a sound I heard often that year. Relief and grief leaving the body together. Valerie attended one workshop 6 months later. She sat in the back, near the exit, wearing a green sweater Miriam would have liked. I did not know she was coming. When I saw her, I almost lost my place. She did not wave. She just sat with both hands folded, listening while I explained how false concern can become a legal strategy. Afterward she waited until everyone left. Then she said, "I used some of those phrases." I said, "Yes, you did." She said, "I did not know they were phrases." I said, "That is how phrases work when someone gives them to you with confidence. They start sounding like your own thoughts." We stood in the empty community room under lights that hummed like the Grange Hall lights had hummed, and for a moment I worried the past would swallow the present whole. Then Valerie said, "I am trying to learn the difference between worry and control." That was the first apology I believed without needing to protect myself from it. Not because it was dramatic, but because it did not ask me for anything. She was not asking for a room in the house. Not asking for immediate forgiveness. Not asking me to say Derek made her do it. She was identifying the work. I told her Miriam would have respected that sentence. Valerie cried then. I let her. Some tears are not manipulation. Some are finally clean because they have stopped performing for a result. The next spring, when the first school group visited the springhouse, Valerie volunteered to help Clara with the children. She did not speak about the lawsuit. She did not tell her version. She handed out paper cups of spring water and told a second-grade boy not to throw gravel into the channel because water has enough work without dodging rocks. I heard Miriam in that and had to walk away for a minute. Healing is cruel that way. It sometimes arrives wearing the voice of what you lost. Caleb found me behind the packing shed. He did not say anything. He just stood beside me until I could breathe right. My son and I had our own repair to do. During the years when Valerie and Derek lived in my house, Caleb had visited less and less, partly because his work was heavy, partly because Derek made every visit feel like a negotiation, partly because I told him everything was fine. We had both participated in the distance, each for reasons that seemed decent at the time. After the hearing, he wanted to overcorrect. He called every morning. He offered to handle every appointment. He tried to turn attention into penance. Finally I told him, Caleb, if you replace Derek's control with your worry, I still lose. That hurt him. It needed to. He learned to ask instead of assume. That may sound small. It is not. Asking is one of the ways love keeps its hands clean. The orchard itself needed recovery too. People think land is passive, but neglected land keeps score. Derek had delayed pruning in the south row because the buyer planned to remove those trees. He had ignored a drainage issue behind the packing shed because future renderings did not include old water paths. He had let invasive blackberry crawl along the lower fence because to him the lower fence was a future villa boundary, not a living edge. Caleb, Clara, 2 orchard workers, and I spent months setting things right. My knee complained. My back complained. My hands remembered. Work is not therapy exactly. Therapy asks you to name pain. Work lets pain ride in the truck while you do something useful. One Saturday, while clearing blackberry, Caleb found another survey stake buried under leaves. Red tape faded pink. He held it up and said, "Should we keep it as evidence?" I said, "No, we keep it as a reminder." We drove it upside down into the ground beside the compost pile. Clara painted liar on it in black marker. It remains there to this day, which may not be elegant, but neither am I. The Spring Trust Board formed in late summer. 5 members. 1 county water specialist, 1 school representative, 1 tribal hydrology advisor, 1 community member, and me during my lifetime. Derek had called the covenant obsolete. The board made it alive. We created rules that would have bored him to death and therefore pleased me deeply. No commercial extraction. No exclusive private event use. Limited educational access. Annual water quality reports. Orchard protection grants. Community emergency water provisions. Miriam's clause had been a trap, yes, but a trap with a future beyond punishment. That was her genius. She never built only to stop something bad. She built so something good would have a place to stand after. The first annual trust meeting was held in the packing shed with folding chairs, bad coffee, and a rainstorm loud enough to make every speaker raise their voice. I looked around and saw the valley in miniature. Farmers, teachers, county staff, children coloring at a side table, Clara correcting someone's plant identification whether asked or not, Valerie near the door with a stack of sign-in sheets, Caleb adjusting a microphone that did not need adjusting. I thought of Derek's renderings. Smooth buildings. Curved paths. Imported trees. People in white robes carrying expensive water in glass bottles. Then I looked at the actual room, imperfect, damp, alive, full of people who knew one another's histories too well and showed up anyway. That is community. It is not clean enough for brochures, which is one of the reasons it matters. Derek tried one final letter from jail before sentencing. It arrived through his attorney, 3 pages, typed, full of phrases like mutual misunderstanding, emotional overreaction, legacy conflict, and regrettable optics. He wrote that he hoped we could one day recognize his intention to elevate the property. Elevate. I carried the letter to the springhouse, read it once, and then did what Evelyn told me not to do with legal correspondence. I laughed. Not because it was funny. Because some people confess even when they think they are defending themselves. He still did not understand that the property did not need elevation. It needed protection from men who confuse height with worth. I gave the letter to Evelyn after making a copy. Controllers do not fully change. At sentencing, Valerie gave a statement. She did not excuse herself. She said Derek had led the plan, but she had lent him credibility because she was family. She said she had repeated concerns she did not verify. She said she had allowed fear of conflict to become participation. The courtroom was quiet. Derek stared straight ahead. I watched the back of his neck turn red. He hated her honesty more than he had ever hated my resistance, because her honesty removed the last family-shaped shield he could hide behind. When I gave my statement, I kept it short. I said, he tried to take my land, but worse, he tried to teach my children that my age made my consent optional. That was the crime I wanted named. The judge did name it. Not perfectly, but enough. Derek received prison time, restitution orders, and restrictions tied to future financial dealings with vulnerable adults. Marion Vale lost her license. The buyer settled. The state referred 2 more families to investigation after patterns surfaced in Derek's emails. That last part mattered. A trap set for me had revealed paths used against others. Miriam would have called that a library result, one book leading to another. A year and a half later, I received a letter from a woman named Elise who said her uncle's farm had been spared because her family recognized the same phrases from my workshop. Elder transition narrative. Capacity optics. Family stewardship. She wrote, we realized they were not helping him prepare. They were helping themselves prepare. I keep that letter in the walnut box with Miriam's covenant copy. Not because I need praise. Because it proves that truth, once documented, can become shelter for people you will never meet. The house is quieter now. Not empty quiet. Honest quiet. There is a difference. In the bad years, silence felt like someone listening from another room. Now it feels like morning before the kettle. Miriam's chair is back by the window. Her photograph is where light touches it. My office files are in my office. The springhouse key hangs by the back door, but there is also a copy with the trust, and the key is no longer a secret that depends on one old man's memory. That matters. Good protection should not require one person to stay strong forever. I have learned that too late, maybe, but not too late to use it. Valerie still lives above Clara's nursery. She and Caleb speak more easily now, though ease is not the same as innocence. On Miriam's birthday, Valerie brought marigolds and planted them along the springhouse path. She did not ask permission. Then she remembered herself and looked at me. I said, "Your mother always liked marigolds." She said, "I know." We worked side by side for 20 minutes, hands in dirt, no speech large enough to ruin it. When she left, Clara inspected the planting and said, "Crooked but sincere." That is probably as close as our family gets to a blessing. People sometimes want me to say I am grateful for what happened because it led to the trust, the workshops, the repairs with Caleb, the honesty with Valerie. I am not grateful for betrayal. Do not let anyone sell you that kind of wisdom too cheaply. Pain can produce good outcomes, but that does not make the pain noble. I am grateful for the people who answered it. I am grateful for Miriam's foresight. I am grateful that my mind held. I am grateful I did not sign. I am grateful that when the pen was in my hand, I remembered the stone under the springhouse floor. That is enough. On clear evenings I sit on the porch with coffee and listen to the orchard settle. Trees make small sounds if you give them time. Leaves clicking. Branches shifting. Fruit dropping softly into grass when no one is there to catch it. The spring moves constantly behind the shed. A low sound, patient, unbothered by contracts. Sometimes I imagine Miriam beside me, not as a ghost exactly, but as the shape of a judgment I still value. She would say I took too long to see it. She would be right. She would say I documented beautifully once I started. Also right. She would say Valerie is not done becoming herself. Right again. Marriage does not end every conversation. Some voices become standards you keep measuring against. One small object remains on my desk now, and I should mention it because every story needs something plain enough to hold the truth. It is not the blue folder. Evelyn kept that in evidence until the case closed, and afterward I told her to archive it where ugly paper belongs. It is not Derek's rendering, though Caleb wanted to frame one in the bathroom as a warning against vanity. The object is a small brass screw from the springhouse floor, one of the old screws that held the loose stone in place. When Caleb lifted the stone that morning and found Miriam's tin box, the screw rolled into the dust near my shoe. I picked it up without thinking and put it in my pocket. Later, after everything, I found it in the washing machine, bright and clean and still stubborn. I keep it beside my coffee mug. It reminds me that protection is often held together by small things no one notices until the day they matter. A screw. A receipt. A waitress's warning. A neighbor's photograph. A sentence in a letter. A daughter who finally refuses to steal a document. A son who decides to read the source instead of trusting the summary. A promise under stone. Derek saw only the large number. $28.6 million. He thought big money would make small things irrelevant. He was wrong. Big schemes fail on small details because small details are where truth likes to hide. Sometimes when school groups visit, a child will ask whether I am rich now because the orchard was almost sold for so much money. I tell them no. Then I tell them maybe. It depends what kind of rich they mean. I have a house where no one lowers their voice when I enter. I have water that cannot be sold out from under the valley. I have a son who calls to ask instead of assume. I have a daughter who is learning to speak without borrowing someone else's certainty. I have a dead wife's handwriting still making greedy men nervous. By my standards, that is wealth enough. I also learned that a protected life does not mean a quiet life. It means the noise no longer decides for you. Bills still come. Pipes still leak. My niece still complains when rain moves in. Some mornings I still reach for Miriam before I am fully awake, and the empty side of the bed tells me the old truth again. But now no one uses that ache as a doorway. No one turns my loneliness into evidence. No one calls my love for this place a symptom. That difference is everything. When I walk the orchard now, I do not walk it like a guard patrolling a fence. I walk it like a man keeping company with promises that held. That is enough for me now. So this is the whole truth as cleanly as I can tell it. A blue folder tried to turn my life into a transaction. A polished man tried to turn concern into control. A daughter I raised helped him because fear and love and weakness got tangled until she could not tell one from another. A son nearly believed the story because distance made him vulnerable to guilt. A dead wife saved us with a clause buried under stone. A community that had been watching quietly stepped forward when watching was no longer enough. And I, an old county controller with a bad knee and a black coffee habit, learned that patience is not always virtue. Sometimes patience is the room where thieves get organized. Do not wait as long as I did. That is the lesson I can offer without dressing it up. When someone starts speaking for you in rooms where you are present, stop them. When someone says signing now will make things easier, ask for copies. When someone turns your age into their authority, bring in a stranger with credentials who is not paid by them. When someone calls your resistance confusion, write it down. And when someone you love is standing on the wrong side of the room, remember that you can love them without handing them the pen. I do not know what you would have done in my place. Maybe you would have seen it sooner. Maybe you would have shouted. Maybe you would have signed because you were tired, and I would understand that more than I want to. But I know what I did. I asked whether they had read Miriam's clause. I let Derek build his stage. I let the cameras roll. I let the buyer come close enough to smell profit. Then I opened the stone and gave the room the truth. If that is revenge, then yes, I took revenge. Not with fists. Not with cruelty. With preparation. With memory. With the law. With the promise my wife left beneath a floor because she knew greed sometimes wears a family face. The spring still runs. The orchard still flowers. The house still breathes when the furnace turns on in winter. My name is still on what matters while I live, and after me, Miriam's name will protect what neither of us could carry alone forever. Derek wanted a legacy event. In the end, he got one. Just not his. God bless everyone who is protecting something they built, something they inherited, or something they promised a loved one they would never let go. May you keep your records. May you trust the uneasy feeling in your chest. May you find the right people before the wrong ones finish their paperwork. And may you always check what is written under the stone before you sign away the water.